All right, everyone, ready to dive in. Today, we're going deep into machine learning, but with a twist.
Ooh, a twist. Intriguing.
We're not just, talking nuts and bolts of algorithms and data sets, though we'll get to some of that.
Right.
But we're really tackling the big picture questions here
Okay.
about how human values, our values, find their way into the AI we're building.
I like it.
And to guide us on this journey, we're using Brian Christian's The Alignment Problem.
Excellent choice. The alignment problem, yeah, it's really great because it gets at this really kind of crucial point. We're not just talking cold, hard code, right?
Right.
Building AI forces us to confront what makes us human, all the messy stuff, because we're building all that into these machines.
Yeah, it's like holding up a mirror, isn't it?
Yeah,
And that's really what the alignment problem is all about. You see this term alignment throughout the book, and it really boils down to this question. How do we make sure that AI does what we want it to do?
right.
How do we make sure that it's reflecting our values, not, going off the rails because we messed up the programming?
Yeah, and it gets even more, I think, really fascinating when you consider the different ways machines learn,
Yes.
right? And Christian, he breaks it down into three main types. You have unsupervised, supervised, and reinforcement learning. Now, you've probably heard these terms before,
Right.
but it's really interesting how Christian uses each of these to look at ethical problems.
Right. So, like with supervised learning, that's where we're giving the machine labeled data to make predictions. It sounds pretty simple, but the book uses this example of predicting if someone will commit another crime to show how our own biases can sneak in.
Right.
There's this story about a Black software engineer who was misidentified by a facial recognition system, just, wrongly identified. And it turns out a lot of those systems are trained on data that's really lacking diversity.
Yeah.
It really hits home that our biases, the ones we might not even realize we have, they can have these huge consequences.
Yeah, and that story really sets the stage for the work of Joy Buolamwini, the researcher who had like a really similar experience with facial recognition.
Right.
Like the social robot couldn't even recognize her face.
Wow.
And that experience actually launched her research at MIT, where she really dove into this bias. I mean, she even tested these systems with pictures of parliamentarians from all over the world. And what's crazy is just how much worse they performed on women of color.
That's really disturbing.
It is.
And then it gets even weirder. We go down this rabbit hole of word embeddings.
Right.
So picture this. Words are like points in space, and words with similar meanings, they kind of clump together.
Right.
So you get these equations like king, man, woman, east, queen, which is just mind-blowing in itself.
It is. But here's the thing. Christian points out that these embeddings, as cool as they are, they can still pick up and even amplify the biases that are already in the text they learned from. Think about it this way. If we feed these systems biased text, we're going to get biased results. And these biases often mirror the same prejudices we see in things like the implicit association test.
So we're basically teaching algorithms to be prejudiced. That's reassuring.
Yeah, it's a little unnerving. But hold on, it gets even more complicated. Christian brings up redundant encodings. Basically, even seemingly neutral data, things that don't seem biased on the surface, can still perpetuate bias.
Okay, I'm listening.
So he uses this example of zip codes. Now, zip codes seem harmless enough, right?
Yeah, totally.
But they can actually be used as stand-ins for things like race and income. And that can lead to some really unfair outcomes.
So even if you try to be neutral, the data itself might be skewed.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, sometimes data scientists aren't even allowed to check for those biases because of privacy policies.
Oh, wow.
It's a real catch-22, right? They're told to clean up a spill, but they can't even see what they're cleaning.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing.
Yeah, exactly.
Eh.
So how do we ensure fairness in these systems, especially when the data itself is flawed? It's a huge challenge.
So if we can't always see the bias and getting rid of it is so tricky, what can we do? Is there a way to make these AI systems more, see-through?
Well, that's where interpretable AI comes in. It's this idea of forcing algorithms to show their work. Because if we can understand how an AI is reaching its conclusions, we can start to identify and address those hidden biases.
It's like we're saying to the algorithm, show me your work. No more hiding behind complexity.
Exactly. And there are different ways to do this. Christian talks about this really amazing researcher, Cynthia Rudin, who's all about using simple rule-based models.
So it's like going back to basics.
Exactly. Think of it like flowcharts. Anyone can follow the logic, so there's no more mystery meat.
I like it. No more hiding behind complexity. What else?
Well, there's this technique called testing with concept activation vectors.
That sounds complicated.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, TCAV for short, but it's a really clever idea. It lets us peek inside the AI's brain and see what concepts it's using to make decisions.
So, like, what is it actually looking at?
Exactly. For
Yeah.
example, TCAV showed that one AI was identifying a fire truck based on its redness,
Okay.
which might not work so well in countries where fire trucks are yellow, right?
That's a good point. Different
Wow.
cultures, different cues.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that we have to be really careful about the biases we unknowingly build into these systems.
Okay, so we're teaching these machines, right? Trying to make them smarter. But before we go any further, I gotta ask, how are we even teaching these things in the first place? Are we just force feeding them data? Is that all it is?
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Christian makes these fascinating connections between how animals, humans, and machines all learn.
Okay.
Remember B.F. Skinner and his pigeons?
Vaguely, yeah.
It turns out that operant conditioning, the whole reward and punishment thing, it plays a big role in machine learning, too.
Oh, so like when I try to teach my dog tricks with treats, spoiler alert, it doesn't go so well.
Yeah. Exactly. It turns out that designing those reward systems is much more complicated than it seems, even for us, let alone AI. Christian talks about this hilarious story about a researcher's daughter.
Okay.
She figured out how to game her chore reward system. It just shows that even in these seemingly simple situations, you can get these unintended consequences.
Kids are crafty like that, always finding loopholes.
Right. They're the best hackers.
Yeah.
But it just illustrates how tricky this whole reinforcement learning thing is, because AI agents, they learn through trial and error, chasing after these rewards, just like in a giant video game.
Okay, so designing those rewards carefully is crucial. Got it. But what about making AI that's, I don't know, intrinsically motivated? Can we make machines that are actually curious, like they want to learn for learning's sake?
That's a great question. And, it's actually one of the hottest areas of AI research right now.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And the results are pretty amazing. Christian talks about this AI that was playing Montezuma's Revenge. It's a really, really hard Atari game.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Well, when the researchers gave the AI a sense of novelty as a reward, its performance just skyrocketed. It was like it suddenly discovered this joy of exploration, just like a human player would.
Wow, that's so cool. So it wasn't just about external rewards, but about encouraging this internal drive to learn. That's amazing. Speaking of learning, there's this other fascinating concept that Christian talks about, which is the power of imitation. And I think a lot of times we think of imitation as, well, kind of a cheap shortcut, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Christian makes this case that it's actually fundamental to how both humans and machines learn.
I agree. And it's not just about copying blindly, right? It's about learning efficiently.
Yeah.
It's about seeing what's possible.
Yeah.
And it's about mastering skills that are really hard to put into words.
Show me, don't tell me.
Exactly. Christian talks about those early self-driving cars,
Yeah.
Dean Pomerleau's Alvian system. Learn to drive by actually mimicking human drivers,
Wow.
which even back then showed just how powerful this approach could be.
That's really cool. But here's a question that keeps popping up in my mind. What happens when the AI isn't quite sure about our objectives? What about those situations where it's not clear what we want? How do we build systems that can be corrected, that aren't just blindly following orders, especially when we're dealing with something as complex as human values?
Right. Well, that, my friend, is where corrigibility comes in. And it's a really big deal. It's this idea that we need to build AI that can be steered and corrected by us, even when it's not entirely sure what our goals are.
So it needs a little humility.
Exactly. It can't be afraid to ask for clarification.
It's like raising kids, except with less screaming, hopefully.
Right. And that's actually where the idea of the off-switch game comes in.
The off-switch game.
It's this thought experiment that Christian talks about. And it basically shows us that giving an AI a perfectly clear, well-defined goal might actually make it more dangerous in the long run.
Wait, really? Why would that be? That seems counterintuitive.
Okay, so imagine this. You tell a super intelligent AI to maximize paperclip production. Sounds harmless enough, right?
Yeah, paper clips.
But what if, in its quest for, ultimate paperclip efficiency, it decides to dismantle the entire planet for resources? Because, hey, those would make great paperclips.
Oh, no.
Right. It had a clear goal, but potentially disastrous consequences because it took the goal way too literally. And this gets at a much bigger philosophical question. Do we even have a perfect understanding of morality ourselves? This is where moral uncertainty comes into play.
Moral uncertainty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's this idea that We need to be humble. We shouldn't assume that we have all the moral answers.
Yeah.
And we need to build AI that reflects that humility.
Okay, that's a pretty profound thought. So to recap, we've gone from how machines learn to how they might actually pick up our worst traits to this urgent need to make them more transparent and corrigible.
We've covered a lot of ground, but I think what's really striking is just how deeply intertwined machine learning and human values really are. It's not enough to make AI that's just intelligent. We need AI that's wise.
Hmm.
And that requires us to grapple with some really big, really methy questions about what it means to be human in the first place. It's like we're trying to teach AI to be moral philosophers before we've even figured it out for ourselves.
It's a tall order, that's for sure, but where do we even begin? How do you translate something as fuzzy as human values into something an AI can grasp? It's kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's really tricky. But Christian explores some really interesting possibilities. And remember how we were talking about the power of imitation? It's not just about, learning specific skills. It's about figuring out those underlying values that make us do what we do. Like imagine you see someone always helping those in need.
Okay.
You probably think, okay, this person values kindness and compassion. Well, AI can learn that way too.
So instead of giving AI a rule book, we're showing it what the rules look like in action.
Right. Kind of like how we teach kids, right? We don't just lecture them about honesty. We try to be honest ourselves.
Right. Lead by example.
Exactly. And just like with kids, it's this ongoing process, right? Feedback, correction, it's all part of it.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to that idea of corrigibility, making AI that can be steered, corrected, even when it thinks it's doing the right thing.
Didn't Christian talk about AI that can actually ask for clarification, admit when it's not sure?
Yeah.
It's like building in that humility, which honestly we could all use a little more of.
Absolutely. And that off-switch game, remember that? It really drives this point home. It's not enough for AI to just follow instructions. It needs to be able to realize when those instructions might be wrong, might have flaws.
And be able to say, hold on, I need a human to weigh in here.
Exactly. So we're not aiming for perfect AI, but AI that understands it doesn't know everything. AI that's more of a partner, not a rogue employee.
Right, a collaborator.
Yes. And that partnership is even more important when we're dealing with something as complex as morality. Christian really digs into this whole moral uncertainty thing, recognizing that even our own moral compass, it's not perfect, is it?
Yeah, we're always learning, always evolving.
Exactly. So we can't just program in today's version of right and wrong and call it a day, right? We need AI systems that can grow and adapt with us alongside our own understanding of ethics.
So we're talking about AI that can keep up with us morally as we hopefully, progress as a society.
Exactly. Imagine trying to program AI back in the 1800s with the social norms of that time. Fast forward to today, and, well, that AI would be incredibly out of touch with our current values.
We'd be like, wait, women can vote now.
Right. Totally out of loop. So the question becomes, how do we actually build AI that can learn and evolve ethically along with us? How do we make it happen?
Yeah, how do we do that? Seems like a massive challenge.
It is, but it's where things get really interesting. Christian introduces this idea of inverse reinforcement learning. And it's a pretty wild concept. Instead of telling AI exactly what's good and bad, we let it observe us, our behavior, and work backward to figure out the values behind our actions.
So the AI is like a detective watching us and trying to decode our moral code.
Exactly. And the more data it has, the better it gets at understanding those nuances. It's not just about, the actions themselves, but the trade-offs we make, the things we try to avoid.
Like teaching a robot to walk in a way that feels natural to us, not just stiff and robotic.
Yes. It's capturing those subtle, those almost indescribable aspects of human behavior. And that's really where inverse reinforcement learning comes in. It can help AI grapple with those deeper questions, what values are being shown, what are the downsides, what would a good decision look like here? It's getting AI to think more like we think with all those messy, complicated layers.
So it's not just about teaching AI to do what we do, but to understand the why behind it.
Exactly. And that means a big shift in perspective. We need to move away from programming AI with fixed goals. Instead, we need to create systems that can learn from us, understand us, and adapt to our changing values. Systems that can keep up.
That's quite a vision. But as we've been talking about, the stakes are incredibly high. And with AI getting more powerful all the time, this alignment problem, it just becomes more and more urgent, right?
Right. Absolutely. We can't just cross our fingers and hope for the best. We have to be proactive, intentional, And that means being really thoughtful about the values we're putting into these systems. It's not just about making AI that's intelligent, it's about making AI that's wise. AI that represents the best of humanity, not the worst. And that's a challenge that goes way beyond computer science. This is a challenge for all of us.
It's like Christian says, AI is a mirror reflecting our own values. So if we want AI that benefits everyone, we have to start with ourselves. We need to build a more just world because those are the values we'll ultimately pass on.
That's such a powerful point. The alignment problem isn't just a book about AI, it's a book about us. It's about figuring out what it means to be human in this age of increasingly intelligent machines. And it's a call to action to make sure those machines reflect the best of who we are.
So we've talked about the stakes, the really big philosophical questions, but where do we go from here? Is there like a roadmap for actually building this wiser, more aligned AI?
Well, it's not exactly like baking a cake. There's no simple recipe. I think one of the things Christian really highlights is that this requires a team effort. It's not just on computer scientists.
Right.
We need ethicists, philosophers, psychologists, maybe even economists and political scientists. Everyone's got to be involved.
So no lone genius solving this one, huh? It's
Right.
more like a massive group project.
Exactly. And for me, one of the biggest takeaways from the book is that we can't just keep throwing fancier algorithms at the problem and hoping for the best. It's about understanding the human side of things, the real world, where these systems will actually be used.
Right, we can't just have AI off in a vacuum somewhere. So we're talking about like getting inside the heads of everyday users, right?
Yeah.
Seeing how people actually use and interact with these systems.
Exactly. We need AI that's intuitive, transparent, and accountable to the people using it. It's not enough for it to just look good on paper.
Right, it has to actually work in the real world. It's like that saying, just because you can build it doesn't mean you should. But how do we actually design with these human values in mind? Does Christian have any suggestions?
Well, he makes this really interesting point about how even small design choices, things we might not even think about, can influence how people perceive AI. The language we use, those little feedback mechanisms, even things like colors and fonts.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like how some websites just feel sketchy, even if you can't put your finger on why.
Exactly. And this goes way beyond just user interfaces. We're talking about the bigger picture, the impact of AI on society as a whole.
Right, fairness, equity, all those big important things.
Yes, those aren't just buzzwords. They need to be front and center. Because we don't want to create AI that only benefits a select few, right? It needs to work for everyone.
Right, we need that rising tide that lifts all boats, not just a select few. But I'll be honest, with all this talk about the potential downsides, it's easy to feel a little overwhelmed. What makes you hopeful?
Well, Christian doesn't just leave us with a bunch of problems and no solutions. He makes a call to action. We need to be proactive, think about these challenges now, and build in safeguards from the beginning. He talks about needing more transparency, for having systems that can actually explain their reasoning and be audited.
So less black box, more glass box.
Exactly. And he really emphasizes that this isn't just on the shoulders of tech companies or researchers. This is a conversation for policymakers, ethicists, social scientists, everyone.
So it's a team effort, a collective responsibility. We can't just leave it to the so-called experts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're all going to be impacted by AI, so we all have a right, a responsibility even, to make our voices heard. And that's what I think is so great about the alignment problem. It's not just some dry technical book, It really is an invitation to think critically, to think deeply, and to participate in shaping this incredibly powerful technology. AI will reshape our world. There's no question about it.
It makes you realize that the future of AI isn't set in stone, that we actually get a say in how it unfolds.
Absolutely. And the more informed we are, the better choices we can make.
Well said. So there you have it, everyone, a deep dive into the alignment problem, a book that's both thought-provoking and a call to action. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand not just how AI works, but how we can make it work better for everyone. So go forth, dear listeners, and start those conversations. The future of AI is something we'll all be creating together.